Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Grab a glass of whatever and join us as we dive deep into the bizarre origins, surprising mechanics, and tiny fine print of games you know or may never have heard of. I am joined, as always, by my host, Troy, and I, of course, am Max. And behind the scenes, we have Jay, our producer, making sure that everything sounds good and everything works. Today's topic is the not always well-known, but certainly influential Laserburn.
This is the original sci-fi skirmish game. I mean, this goes right back to 1980, and this is the inspiration point for basically everything with lasers that comes afterwards.
Yeah, going through this one and doing a bit of research, I can't think of a sci-fi man-to-man combat game that predates this that is also a miniatures game.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I mean, it may exist out there. Don't get me wrong, but this game's specific origins come from old Western games.
Yeah, this was created by Bryan Ansell in 1980. It is an early UK war game, and it was absolutely based upon original Western games. These were titles that had been around since the 1970s, and they had a big influence on Bryan when he went ahead to make this game.
Yeah, so the two titles that we know had a direct influence on this were Once Upon a Time in the West, published in 1978, which is, well into the height of tabletop wargaming, and the other one being Western Gunfight Wargame Rules, which is also British, if I remember correctly, and has its own interesting origin point in the affective role-playing games to some degree, because I remember reading that Gary Gygax was well aware of that as he was developing Dungeons & Dragons. Both games are a skirmish-style wargame, which is to say a man-to-man, independent-initiated action sequences for each figure, and is probably meant to be played on a not too large table, but I can imagine, based on some of the stuff that we get into later, it could be played on quite a large scale if you wanted. It was originally conceived as a World War II themed game, but it very quickly gravitated into a sci-fi game.
It's really interesting that it would have started as World War II, because you can see a certain Band of Brothers quality to the stories you could tell with this. But I think it's such a natural fit for sci-fi where this game goes and the type of scenarios you get into with this. And I just don't think there would be the same variety and breadth as something that would be more historically themed.
Yeah, I mean, I can possibly draw an analog between, say, the Dam-Busters film and Star Wars, The Trench Run.
100%.
Where, the World War II isms certainly bake themselves into the Flash Gordon-y thing in that particular context to make something new. And in this case, the World War II style gameplay, you just replace their Thompsons and their rifles with laser guns, then you're off anyway. So
exactly.
So apparently, at least according to the notes in the game and some other descriptions of it that I found, it's meant to append other RPGs, in the sense that if you don't have, it's hard to imagine the game not having adequate rules for handling group combat, because we're not talking mass combat. A lot of early war games might have that, but it's not or role-playing games, I should say, might have that, but it's not a guarantee. But I guess if you prefer your role-playing game to have these rules, and we'll get into why you may or may not want that, it was the intention of Bryan Ansell to supplement his existing role-playing games.
I guess it would be maybe Traveler they were talking about in many regards as to what this would be a graft onto for.
I'd assume so, because that would be the preeminent sci-fi game of the time. But the dice systems don't line up. But maybe that was the thing that they thought they wanted to play with. To give context, the Games Workshop would have been importing games from the US and would have still had their license to Dungeons and Dragons, but they would have also had license to Traveller, RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu, a lot of those early Chaosium games. And this game uses a D100 system in perhaps the most bizarre way I've ever seen. Not necessarily in the convention of its rolling, but more in its statistics.
100%.
I guess if you preferred the D100 over the D6 that Traveller, the 2D6 that Traveller uses,
it does feel like it's supposed to replace the combat of a game with a much clunkier combat system. Not to suggest that Laserburn isn't clunky, but I just think that's an interesting idea, but I don't know how much in practice other people outside of this original community of Laserburn players that Bryan Ansell talks about actually used it in that way, as opposed to just a standalone game.
Yeah, I think the only takeaway from that point is that this is probably more or less a pet project that then saw new life as a skirmish strategy wargame.
Yes, indeed. That makes a lot of sense. And it does introduce a lot of concepts that are going to become very central to sort of that grim, dark version of sci-fi wargaming, because we're going to get Imperial Inquisitors, the Black Guard, and the Imperial Army all making an early appearance here in Laserburn before they show up in other bigger properties like Games Workshop's Warhammer 40,000.
Yeah, for sure. And they're in a very sort of nascent state in the way that they're written in this book, which we will get into the lore. But as far as origins to that lore, you can absolutely tell that Bryan reads way too much 2000 AD magazine, and probably a lot of British sci-fi that has that cynical edge, but also this sort of grand epic scale. There's talk of like mega cities and, planetary conflicts and whole planets getting wiped out. And I'm like, that sounds familiar for the time. So let's get into the rules and kind of get the lay of the land here. First off, as far as a book goes, it is not the easiest read.
No, it's not.
For a few reasons. One, the layout is messy and, I don't want to say random, but very almost stream of consciousness as far as how things actually appear. Certainly modern gamers probably find it a bit frustrating at times. It's a single column layout, which is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Be able to kind of scan through pages and then have to wrap your eye across the entire length of the page is mildly frustrating.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially for the wide format of the book, because we're looking at a magazine. It's fairly broad. It may have been a zine cut or like a digest size. I can't tell. It seems bigger than that. But the way that it's laid out, we have a digital copy that we're looking at. It spans a little bit too much. That maybe that's just a product of it being in a digital format. But also the writing style, well, it's definitely less obscure than, say, the first edition of Tunnels and Trolls. It's still quirky and not necessarily user-friendly. I mean, it's not impenetrable. I certainly had an easy enough time understanding the concepts, but I think it was more the layout that it jumps around quite a lot.
Yeah, it's very conversational in that way where it feels like you're chatting with the author. However, it's like chatting with someone who is jumping from page to page because you are getting just such... Like, for example, we're used to reading a guide that will walk you through the sequence of events as you're likely to encounter them. This book starts with your introductory starter scenarios. So it kind of puts the cart before the horse in many regards.
And it's not as though this is a new concept, though I think maybe in the UK there might be an isolation of the market available for certain games. Because having read some Avalon Hill and SPI games around this era, it's again, some of those ones have got like 3-column layouts and very denoted chaptering and subchaptering. And in this case, like for instance, there's an index at the back, but it's the same order as it comes in the book. So technically it's actually a table of contents that comes at the end, instead of having an alphabetized subject matter. But the book isn't long enough to warrant having a full-blown index, so then again, it is a rule book, so I don't know. It was very much someone's personal project, and they were just kind of winging it. I don't think it's typeset on a typewriter, but it looks like it is.
Yeah, I agree.
The graph layout certainly suggests that it was probably done through some other process, some more professional printing process, but it still has an amateurish quality about it. The art as well is kind of the same thing. It's very evocative, but anatomically not on point.
Yeah, like bow-legged squatting dudes are all over the place.
Hip placement that would boggle the mind. But to the art's credit, it reeks of style.
It does. It's evocative.
Yeah, and it's something that is fairly in tune with games of that era. Though interestingly enough, the UK historically has produced a lot of really great illustrators for role-playing games. Most role-playing games and war games are pretty limited as to usually you just get your buddy who knows he can draw. Or you know he can draw, or she can draw. Or
yeah, it was Tony Yates who did this book. And he's credited as also being an idea man on the project. So just looks like it was a friend who had a pen and pencil and got to work on some illustrations.
Yeah, someone who's keen to put pictures. And I appreciate that they're there. It definitely breaks up the space. It adds some visual variety. It does get you into the feeling of it.
Did you have a favorite piece from the book?
I kind of like some of the really bad ones just because they look really...
The Renaissance puffy sleeves are my favorite appearance with the laser pistol. Just
those are pretty good. In the equipment section with the jet bikes, there's this one figure's got this cool pose. He's got a helmet that looks like he's got like fin horns.
Oh, cool.
And he's holding a blaster upward. And yeah, he's got that sort of striped Renaissance looking sleeve wear in the foreground. And he's just got like a bunch of unnecessary details, which I think also his cod piece is strangely proportioned.
Yeah.
Not protruded necessarily, but just really big. It's like he's wearing a gigantic belt buckle. But anyway, that should give you some idea of what the art is like. But yeah, there's a lot of fun, quick little diagrams of weapons. There's a few slightly scantily clad but fairly classy looking ladies. Little battle scenes. Most of it's sort of thumbnail sized, but a lot of it it's the right thing. It just feels like it needs a bit of tuning up.
And this book starts off with a little bit of valuable information before we dive right into the scenarios. And it gives you a breakdown of its scales. This is a game that plays both in 15 millimeter and 28 millimeter with the same measurements. So you wouldn't necessarily play them with two different scales, other than the miniatures themselves can be different depending on your collection or preference. And for a lot of miniature games, 15 to 28 mil use the same measurements. It's just up to you to decide if you like the bigger models in 28 mil that are, more rich with detail, or you prefer the more accurate, we'll call it ground scale, that you get between the figures when you're working in 15 millimeter. And the distance scale in this is in metric, so that's interesting. And in the game world, so on the table, 1 centimeter is 1 meter. So it is effectively scaled for 15 millimeter if you're considering that as, like your actual watermarks, pardon me. That would be a 15 millimeter scale figure. But 28 mil, like many other games, is kind of what people are drawn to. So it really is up to you to decide how you want to go in there. And there are no depictions of models in the book. There is a catalog reference at the back for models you might purchase from Citadel, but that would be about as much as you get.
Yeah. It's interesting that it's interesting that it's in metric, but that makes sense based on, I think, more or less the suggestion is 15 mil because most bases for 15 mil are about a centimeter size.
Yeah. Or like a 20 millimeter, maybe, you know what I mean? Something like that, perhaps.
Yeah. The one thing that works a little bit against that, though, again, there's nothing wrong with doing 15 mil with a man-to-man command level.
Mm-hmm.
But I typically think of 28 when it comes to that command level where it's essentially a squad versus a squad in size.
Yeah. Like a gang fight, to me, is 28 millimeter.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of precedent for that. That's probably informing me for that assumption.
Sure.
But like, I feel 28 millimeter really shines when each character is a model and there's a relation to like, oh, that's John. That's my guy. And I like that in 28 mil as opposed to 15 mil. Maybe it's not like a lot harder, but it is harder to call out the individual characters and models unless they are dramatically posed different or armed very obviously differently.
Yeah, once you get under 20 millimeters, it becomes harder to individually identify characters unless they're really distinctly different.
So 28 mil to me kind of strikes as the way that I would play Laserburn.
Yeah, same. And for most of those Western games, 28, I think, is more of the recommended size. Though it's important to remember that this early in the history of wargaming, the standardization of what scale you should actually use is pretty loose.
And they're probably calling 28 millimeter 25 millimeter at this time. So the scale is even fluid in that sense. Like the models just get bigger as time goes on. If you think about 15 mil, it's 18 mil for the most part these days. So that's just a consideration as you get started in this book. But to kind of break from the flow that this book goes into, we'll go through the system in a little more detail. But what it does with the actions that you can take with each character or figure in the game is it allows you to break them down into thirds. So it's kind of nice. I like 3 actions. It feels like you have a handful of choices to make.
There's certainly a lot of games I can think of that have a split action between, like a 2-action.
Like a move shoot, right?
Yeah, 2-action activation system. Move shoot. Yeah, that's a typical one. This one's kind of cool because it can be shoot or move, shoot, move, which might be the reason why. There's certainly other suggestions later in the book that support that claim. Yeah, I like it too. I don't know. Maybe it has to do with that intuitive thing I have about multiples of 3 in war games, but this game doesn't use D6s, so that doesn't really make sense.
Yes.
But I generally like that idea.
I think it works.
Yeah. And there's an interesting variety of things you can do with those actions, but we'll get into that. Now, we've been hinting at it kind of all the way through, but like, what is the actual resolution system?
It's a D100 game, effectively. I mean, not effectively, it is. So you'll take this on, you'll roll your D100, so you're throwing the bones, but it is we'll call it a heavy modifier game. There's a lot of things that are going to go into every roll, not in a necessarily overwhelming way, but in the way that your stats are a little bit out of line with what you may be expecting for a D100 game, as a lot of the time your stats are over 100, even starting at 120 and getting up to 180 if you're truly elite. So the very assumption is that when you go to make your D100 roll, you're already catching modifiers that are going to reduce your odds of success. And then you'll make your D100 roll, hopefully scoring equal to or less to be able to pass your shooting, your action check, whatever it is that may be appropriate.
So in game design terms, this probably be flagged as a value scaling issue.
Yes.
Because, there's a bunch of modifiers that would deduct so that it would probably, like an attack would probably fall within the 100 range of the dice, but it's still really strange to me that the values are so high. Like, why not use smaller modifiers?
Yeah.
Which is strange because I think the smallest modifiers they have are 5%.
Yeah, it gets pretty incremental. So they're still playing with small pieces of change, I guess. But it's an inelegant way to go about statting your characters is to have them all over 100 with the idea that they're at least going to be having a minus 30 due to all these circumstantial modifiers.
Well, and then there's the tedium of going through each of those modifiers and checking to whether they apply and then adding the 5 to 20%. I mean, some of them are quite high. There's some that are like 50.
Yeah, if you try and one-hand a heavy weapon, it's like a 60% penalty or something crazy.
Yeah, I prefer a smaller range overall. And it's strange because if you look at what I think he's taking from, which would be things like RuneQuest and other games that adopt a percentile system, that's like, they don't do that so much. Like, yeah, you can have a score that goes above 100, But that's not typical. But then those are role-playing games where you'd be progressing and you would have, if you were using magic or something to improve your outcome, then that was when that would apply. But yeah, it's just strange that the like starting values go like 120, as you were saying, for like weapon skills and combat skills.
Yeah, it is kind of bizarre how that works. But D100 is a really effective way of resolving a lot of checks. It's pretty intuitive as it's just a percentage, but this game kind of makes it weird, just the way that it scales those numbers.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, can you think of another skirmish level game that uses percentile dice?
We jump forward decades to Skirmish Sangin.
Okay.
Which is a I think it's either Australian or from New Zealand. I apologize. And it is a contemporary asymmetrical warfare game. And that is a D100 game. And it's like you control a fire team of soldiers. And you're making it's kind of straddling that line between a skirmish game and a role-playing game. Because a lot of the times you're doing things like interacting with people to get intelligence and things in addition to gunfighting.
Right.
But that's really the other one that comes to mind. Like there are D10 games I can think of, like Oathmark and Sludge and stuff.
Super popular. Yeah, super popular now to use D10s as your base.
But I can't really think of a lot of percentiles.
It's interesting that didn't take off, especially at that command level.
Yeah.
Because it effectively works like a role-playing game. I do see a general sort of resistance to using percentile dice broadly, except within those games that have established themselves to use those dice.
Yeah, it's like if you've already done it, you're allowed to do it, but otherwise people frown on it.
I guess the idea is you're narrowing yourself, that you hope that whoever is already familiar with that system will then also play your weird war game.
Yes.
I don't know. It's like, yeah, maybe if you Cthulhu themed your skirmish title, then it might work out.
There are more Cthulhu skirmish games now than there have ever been before.
Fair.
So that's a thing.
Yeah. Though I don't know that any of them use those dice. So anyway, moving on. So the game, and again, not unlike the scale that we're working at, has facing rules.
It does.
And that applies as an example of some of those modifiers, depending on the direction that you're taking fire, and also your ability to react to fire, which is also an interesting quality of the game.
It does, however, say, though, that the facing rules can be a source of conflict or contention with your opponent or other wargamers. So
sure.
They make an interesting statement about it. They kind of say that you can opt out of using it if you feel that you're going to be playing in, I guess, perhaps a more competitive environment or with people you're not as familiar gaming with, for example. But they do specify that it is effectively optional, which is kind of interesting.
I mean, I've seen ways of resolving that particular facet where, so sometimes the model isn't positioned in such a way where it's obvious as to which way they're facing.
Yeah, looking one way
and their body is positioned in another. And the easiest way I've seen that resolved is that I think there's generally two, is not using a round base, so using a hex or square base.
Yes,
because that gives you corners by which you can denote, oh, I can see that corner, or by marking the base with something. That's
what Bryan Ansell talks about in the book, is to paint a stripe down the front and back of the base to indicate the direction of facing.
Yeah, that might mess with the look of it, depending on how overboard you go.
I know.
I can see just adding a tick to the rim.
I like my clean, nice, black rim that looks so good. I don't want to put like a racing stripe on my model.
Yeah, exactly. It just seems like a weird thing to do. Maybe you'd be able to hide it, like if they were standing on the base was like a street and there was like a dividing line.
Uh-huh.
But that would be about as good. And be weird to put that on every one of them.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an optional, we'll call it an optional rule.
Yes.
But more to the core of this, we should actually get into how characters are statted.
Your 3 core stats, we'll go through them in more detail, but just to give you the top-down perspective, you've got weapon skill, combat skill, and initiative.
It's pretty simple.
Your weapon skill represents gunplay, your shooting. It's kind of counterintuitive that weapon skill equals your shooting when later in other games that use that same term, they mean melee, but Don't worry about it. In this game, we're talking about ballistic combat. Combat skill, that's your hand-to-hand, and that will apply to any melees, anything using like a power glove or any other weapon like that. And lastly, initiative is representative of both agility and perception. And it also is sort of a catch-all. It kind of is your game master stat. If you're playing a scenario with a game master or a referee who would then call upon a character to hack a terminal, it would be on initiative that you would use to resolve that, for example.
Yeah, it's a sort of generic skill.
Yeah, it's a skill.
And I mean, I guess it's not uncommon to use like simplified mechanics like this. An example is Fighting Fantasy tends to use very simple stats to represent a whole range of things. But yeah, it's just interesting to see initiative used so broadly.
But it's really important in the way this game works for turn sequence, because initiative will determine your placement in the turn sequence. Because it's not a command and control game, right? It's like we've said, it's a Western game, effectively, that's been put into a sci-fi setting. So your characters are gunslingers, and they're going to act, on their initiative when they're ready. So that stat, even though, weapon skill and combat skills seem obviously the key stats, this initiative is really going to be important in actually making sure your character lives long enough to use the other skills.
For sure. It's definitely core. And it fills in what, an aspect to other strategy games. So yeah, I mean, let's just jump ahead to the turn sequence just in general. So as I understand from like the way the book is laid out, initiative it's on a roll, I think, and it's high to low. Each unit has a single activation, and it's basically just round robin through every unit.
Each unit then gets their chance, right, to take their action broken down in thirds.
Yes, exactly. And then so that there's a move shoot sequence, and the way that that's broken down is pretty crazy when you actually look at the list of actions that can be chosen. A lot of them are just 1/3 movements. There's a couple which there's like a 2/3 movement. I think there's an example for that, and then there's a full movement, I guess. I don't know, maybe they call it a 3/3.
So for example, a 2/3 move would be loading a new magazine or battery, or whatever the GM would specify as appropriate. A full move would be taking items from a body or unconscious individual. So if you have to like get down and loot somebody.
Yeah.
But typically most actions, you're right, are 1/3 of a move. They could be anything from kneeling, resting a weapon, firing a shot. And also they cover semi-automatic and full automatic. So you can use all of your actions for shooting. It's not quite like you might expect where you only get one attack and one move.
You can just absolutely double, triple down on one action. There are penalties for firing repeatedly. So there's like a first shot's fine. Second shot penalty, third shot penalty. It uses a modifier to that effect. There's also a massive penalty for like firing like a two-handed weapon with one hand. I think that's the one that has the biggest modifier on it. It's very intuitive as far as the way that it plays, but it's so particular in some of the executions that the game actually comes with a simplified set of rules for itself.
It does.
Mainly for its initiative system.
And modifiers too.
And modifiers, yes. Which just shows that at the very least, Ansell's like aware of the challenges and eccentricities of his own game. Or someone was.
Yeah, there's secretly an advanced version of the rules just interlaced into this game that you can engage with, which includes facing, which gets the full list of modifiers included. But it's sort of strange that the author inconsistently enforces that, if you know what I'm trying to say. Like, this set of rules is considered core, but this rule, you can leave that out. So it's a little inconsistent in that regard. But once you've gone through that sequence, you can also act out of your turn order. We should specify too. That will catch you yet more modifiers. And because you are engaging someone in an initiative sequence, if you hit them, you can also change their position in the initiative sequence, kind of like we've seen in other Western style titles, where you're sort of consciously aware of where people are going to be in initiative order, and then you can strike them, wound them, and reduce their position. So there's different strategies that come into play with that. But again, it's just more modifiers, which is not for everyone at all times. But it does allow you to deal with the fact that people can take the triple action and do a move, shoot, move. Because in many games, if you move, shoot, move, there's nothing to shoot on your turn. But here you can act out of your turn order to interrupt that. So you will catch modifiers, but at the same time, it gives you a reactive capability that deals with the way the action economy works in this game, which I think is important.
I agree, yeah. There's a lot of flexibility in it. I think it's more just the peculiarity of how the rules are laid out and how some of the values add up to doing things.
Yeah.
I can see the vision of what's going on, and I 100% agree with it. And by no way do I think it's an unplayable game. It seems quite playable.
Yes.
It even looks fun. Like, it's probably too dated now because there's more efficient and effective ways of doing this, but there's a lot of good ideas in here. Yeah, because again, acting out of turn could sort of be treated as being like everyone has the potential to be on Overwatch if they haven't spent all their actions.
Yeah, everyone's on Overwatch all the time, kind of.
There's an interesting, unpredictable quality about that, and I know that I've seen some Western games that do things similar to that. I think Boot Hill has at least the first or second edition of it has an out-of-sequence kind of action system that basically allows for the exact same thing.
Yeah, and it defines 2-hour war games, for example, with their whole reactive game system. So it's out there.
You can see how this was popular. Like, I don't have any problem seeing that. But it is, I wouldn't call it impenetrable, but messy.
And one of the fun ways this game shows off its ideas is through the example scenarios that we'll get to now. These are going to be played again and again and again in terms of their themes and their execution. And we're going to see this as the prototype of so many other sci-fi games that come to follow, especially from the GW, the workshop studio. So the first one is also the weirdest one, but it is called Encounter at Spaghetti Junction.
If I were to paraphrase the title, it would be Plays in Traffic. Basically, you have this road intersection, and supposedly you're in some kind of mega city, and you have two gangs that are fighting, and there are rules for rounds that are ended when standing in the road to see if anybody gets hit with a car, which is pretty novel, especially for the first scenario suggested. I guess it's trying to go with the wow factor. I believe this scenario also includes quite a few other quirks of equipment and things like that. But for the most part, it's starting off with something really novel, which is basically a traffic lane shootout.
Yeah, it's getting your attention. And I think that is why the scenarios are at the front of this book, is to grab you by the collar, show you what a sci-fi game can do, and sort of inspire you to come up with your own scenarios.
I definitely get a distinctive Judge Dredd vibe from this scenario.
I do too.
This one is more influenced than necessarily influential, but as we go through the next ones, you can see the seeds of things to come, especially reading through them in not so subtle ways.
Yes.
Not that it's deliberately doing this. I think they're just kind of like, that's a cool idea, that's a cool idea, that's a cool idea. And then later on, somebody comes back, revisits that, and is like, hey, that should be a whole game. So the next example of this is what's called Sewerville Shootout. And it is basically what it sounds like. It's gangs fighting in an underground sewer system with some nasty natural hazards and, I guess, corridor fighting in effect. However, it is strongly reminiscent in its structure and layout of a game that would come later that we will get into as far as setting that up, which is Necromunda.
100%.
I mean, do you want to get into some of the similarities with this scenario?
Well, the fact that it's like an underground corridor fight, that is Hive City 101. And the pools of green goo, that acid that you can't step into, all of that really strikes those underhive hazards, right? Mm-hmm. So it completely informs the early work that's going to later become Necromunda. And in many ways, it's kind of like the first scenario you play when you buy the Necromunda box set.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just corridors, hallways with some green goo on the ground, and then you and your gangs shoot each other. They still haven't really changed the basic formula that this represents.
I mean, it's fairly classic as far as that goes together, and that'll be true of the next scenario.
For a few gonads more. Again, great title. Like, he nails these names.
Oh, and you can tell the Western theme is just pervasive throughout the entire thing.
100%.
So Few Gonads More is a scenario set, and, stop me if this sounds familiar, on a massive derelict spacecraft that's crawling with aliens, and your one player plays as a group of treasure hunting exterminators.
Yeah, intrepid explorers going through the depths of a big old scary spaceship.
Yeah, so the haunted house in space will definitely fall into it as an early concept for, I think, very likely be inspired to be Space Hulk later.
Yes.
Which is a board game, but it is essentially a miniatures game as well. I will say that is a massively evocative setting because it is a dungeon crawl in a spaceship.
Yeah, it really works. It really works.
They must have known that it was deserving of its own game. I won't say Space Hulk is divisive, but some people get more mileage out of it than others. And some of that might be nostalgia, but it's always been popular. And especially, if you pitch that idea to somebody, they're into it, at least for the first time.
That's right.
And then, we get the last scenario, which is shot by both sides. And it's simple in description, but a little bit complicated in how it plays out. So it's essentially an ambush of a throne room.
Yeah, think of it like a special forces type of thing, right?
Yeah, where a group of well-equipped mercenaries burst onto the scene of some equally well-equipped guards and royal entourage. And it's like the scenario says, the well-equipped mercenaries are somehow pinned between two forces. I assume that they have some sort of advantages to that, but it's important to remember that with all of these, they're just text descriptions. There's no mapping or suggested layout. You basically it gives you a few features that you should include, but it's kind of up to you where you put them. And the idea of playing a band of hired killers is very similar to the game Kill Team.
It definitely rings like Kill Team, especially the spec ops nature of shot by both sides.
Yeah.
So it connects with that title as well. And you can basically see all of the Games Workshop's skirmish sci-fi penned in this 1980 list of example scenarios.
Yeah, it definitely rings true as far as the rest of their sci-fi franchises will pan out. I mean, obviously there'll be a number of other things. You could say that For a Few Gonads More also probably inspired Space Crusade, because that's essentially similar to Space Hulk.
Oh yeah, I think you're right.
Again, it's that core concept that there's this dangerous but profitable environment that we can exploit, and then that's the setup for the whole thing. So you're going into all these scenarios, you've got these teams, but what is the gear? What's the kit you're bringing in?
Yeah, you will have your assortment of ballistic weapons, energy weapons, you've got melee weapons. There's quite an assortment of things you can bring with you into the combat. When you go ahead and engage people, there's armor as well that they can use to protect themselves. So there's dreadnought armor, power armor, light armor, and then flak/mess armor. And that will all be there to protect you from the pretty wide-ranging list of weapons. There's a lot of different variation, and there are deductions per meter for the different ranges. So again, we're talking about those modifiers. But of interest, this is the first time bolt weapons show up in a war game.
Yeah.
So you get a bolt rifle and a bolt pistol, heavy bolt rifle, and an assault rifle, all firing the classic mass reactive bolt round.
That whole concept behind bolt weapons is pretty fully laid out in this game, and I don't think changes. I mean, it's added on to, but
some of the names change, but that's about it.
There's also a few other things that are similar or nearly the same as other things that other forces in, say, Warhammer 40K or any of the other sci-fi extensions of Games Workshop might include. One of the weird standouts that makes makes a mention in one of the scenarios is the needle gun.
Yes.
I'm going to give a description of this one. This one's mechanically, considering everything else you're doing, it might be a bit mechanically problematic to include, but it's worth mentioning the novelty of it.
It shows up in Encounter at Spaghetti Junction because they describe police and law enforcement using the needle weapons, and how they work is really bizarre. Needle weapons have a 3-turn delay before resolving, including resolving that's a hit roll. So you'll fire at someone, and it's assumed that this chemical dart may hit them, may not hit them, but you don't know until the effect would come into effect. And it will either be a poison dart, which would, kill or incapacitate, or it would be a stun dart, which would, subdue somebody.
Yeah.
And that would be what you're trying to achieve with that weapon, but you have to wait for this delayed result. And I just feel like that's a lot to deal with when you have 8 police officers, all with needle weapons, firing at 8 gang members, hitting them at different times. It's kind of creating a cascade of things to be aware of. However, it is pretty flavorful.
It is, yeah. I'd give it that. But I don't see the advantage of that. Is it that you hope to conclude your scenario before all your guys pass out or die? I don't fully understand why that would be worth doing, is the short way that I think about it. Aside from it being oh yeah, it's cool to have a long flechette shoot through somebody, turn into a gas-like liquid apparently, and then enter the bloodstream.
Yeah, right? What is going on with that? But also very cool.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of things in sci-fi that play around with that idea. And it's interesting. It may just have a mention here because Ansell thought it was cool. It seems like a lot of extra bookkeeping for not a lot of payoff.
And you do get other weapons that are much simpler. So it's almost I don't know why I'd pick a needler over a bolt rifle.
Yeah.
But you do have a range of things like hand flamers as well, and some different heavy weapons like auto lasers. And my favorite melee weapon, just because it makes me think of Nintendo, is the Power Glove.
Oh, yeah.
And it's definitely an early Power Fist that you'll get in 40K, but it's just a little different here.
Yeah. So again, there's a good variety. Again, some of those range increments being quite crunchy is another example of that unnecessary level of specificity with modifiers. But yeah, as far as the feel of the game, oh yeah, it's all over it. So this game came out and it was fairly popular from what I can tell. It caught on, at least within a circle of people, including a lot of people who worked at both Citadel and Games Workshop. They began, I think it may have even influenced some lines of models, though I don't think necessarily officially for this game, but it warranted the production of 4 expansions. Expansion for the first one might be in heavy quotes, but technically it is in the same line of products. So the first one of these is Imperial Commander. It is, in its own right, its own game, with a much larger battle scale. I think it's more on the range of platoon level, probably higher than that, depending. This definitely leans more into the smaller ground scale. But Imperial Commander is very obviously going to become the first edition of Warhammer 40,000, i.e. Rogue Trader. Troy, do you have any particular thoughts, considering that this game is both an expansion, so to speak, and the inception for probably the largest active franchise of that particular company?
You're right. This base game gives rules for coherency and squad leaders. So there is the basic information you need to start playing bigger fights with squads instead of individuals. But it is not until Imperial Commander that gets streamlined and gets actual attention like it's intended to play that way.
Yeah, because Laserburn has certainly considerations for things like morale and the effects of commanding units, at least in a very loose sense.
Yeah, like loss of commander and stuff.
Exactly. But Imperial Commander, I guess in some ways, if you can think of it as an add-on, it adds rules that you could include into your Laserburn fight, but it also includes a complete set of rules for using large companies of soldiers. The next one is Forces of the Imperium, which is more of a lore and unit expansion. It also includes a lot more equipment or slightly modified equipment. I think it also includes a lot of errata to fix up some of the rules that may have been poorly explained or maybe through further testing didn't pan out. Then you have one that's just called Robot.
I love it.
Which does what it says on the tin and includes robots and how you would include and spec those into your game, as well as some other additional equipment rules somewhat related to that. And then finally, there's Advanced Laserburn and Aliens, which brings all of it kind of together and then adds a list of alien species that you can choose alternately. Aliens are mentioned as something, but in the original game, but then it's literally just a single paragraph that actually promises that book's content to come. But otherwise, they just say, just give some special abilities and tweak some stats. And yeah, there's this whole line of things that just fall out of this. Like, this is kind of the whole start of Warhammer 40,000's brand, in a sense, but like unmarked at this point.
Yeah, I just want to correct myself from earlier. There is a catalog in the back, but it's not Citadel. It's Tabletop figures, also from Nottingham, but they're in 15 as opposed to 25 or 28. So there are specific models available. They just don't come from who you may expect, knowing Bryan Ansell and where he works.
Yeah, and it's fairly early in the career of these companies, so it might be expected that he'd go with the more storied producer. And then, yeah, I guess we can get into the lore, which is brief but very reminiscent of, well, a lot of things. It certainly will become an influence in some of its descriptions regarding the franchise that it would become or will become. There are effectively two factions. There's a core inner, I want to call it inner sphere, but I know that that's Battletech. Inner galaxy called the Imperium of Earth. And it is a civilization that has risen and is now into the decline, slowly falling more and more into warfare. It's depleted its resources of all of its world and is now having to expand outward into the outer colonies. Its main armies are its Imperial Inquisitors. To make a hint there, they also talk about Lord Knights, I think is one, which aren't Space Marines per se, but kind of fill that role. And they actually have companies of what they call Space Marines, but they're not what we would think of them now. I think they're just highly trained elite units. And they rule with an iron fist, but are decadent and warlike, which is not terribly different from their opponents, which are the Red Redemptionists, which are effectively, and I'm quoting more or less directly from this, settlers of the fringe that originate from Near Eastern, Middle Eastern, and African nations that worship some god called Allah.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a strange way to go about characterizing the opposition force in this game, because they kind of do stage the Imperium as sort of more the protagonist force. So there's definitely some perhaps out-of-date ways of characterizing this other force, but they do contrast a lot with the Imperium of Earth in the way that they work in terms of the troops and their, I guess, approach to things.
Yeah, I never got the sense that it was specifically bigoted because both sides were equally awful.
Yeah, I totally agree.
It was more just characteristic, and I guess there might be he might be guilty of some exoticism, but I didn't think that it was ill-meant. He was just looking for something that opposed the kind of vaguely European imperial thing, and then just looking for something that was culturally different, but also had its own teeth, so to speak.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's a rough interpretation, surely. But I think he's basically just trying to set up that theme that we'll see in other sci-fi games that he's worked on, where there are no good guys.
Mm-hmm.
I think is the short way of putting it. Yeah, that it's these opposed forces that are, in this case, either desperate, decadent imperial forces versus a bunch of religious zealots.
Yeah, 100%. There's not a lot of home team in this game, so to speak, for who your faction might be. It really is an early example of make them all bad guys so we don't have to morally equivocate.
For sure. And I guess the closest example, I don't want to draw a real life conclusion, but I think some people get a similar lack of ambiguity if they're, say, doing a World War II game between Russians and Germans.
I do feel like there's a definite advantage to making a war game where there isn't a question of moral superiority between the factions. It's more just the contest on the table. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it comes from the sort of fiction of things like 2000 AD, especially Judge Dredd, where obviously the criminals that Dredd is fighting are bad, though in some stories they may be somewhat more justified. But then Dredd is also a deeply authoritarian kind of law figure.
Yeah, it's true. And I think 2000 AD really created that grimdark that underscores a lot of the British dark sci-fi that we have for our wargaming. And this takes that lead and establishes it early.
Yeah, for sure. And like, not even just in Judge Dredd, but ABC Warriors and Strontium Dog, and they all have that cynical bite to them.
Forgot about ABC Warriors.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
Yeah, no, that I recently found a sort of reprint of that, and I was enjoying some of the absurdisms.
There is a skirmish miniature game for ABC Warriors.
Really?
Yeah. So every property has a skirmish game right now. So that's just how it is.
Wow. I would have thought some people had forgotten about that one. But so that kind of sums it up as far as there isn't a ton of detail. I would say that what's there is very distinctive and very evocative, but it feels more like a template. And in fact, even earlier when he describes the use of a setting, he basically just tells you to rip off whatever you like, which is clearly what he's done.
100%.
And we'll see more of that once we explore more of the offspring of these games.
Yeah, so let me know what you thought about this. What do you think is the biggest win in this book?
I think the biggest win in this book is that it is a sci-fi skirmish game, flat out. I'm a big fan of that command level. I'm obviously somebody that likes role-playing games, and I also have a fondness for Western miniatures games. I recently picked up Too Fat Lardy's What a Cowboy, and am reading my way through that and very excited to try it out. But I've also liked and played Boot Hill and other various games. And just to see that style of play done as something other than a Wild West game, and with such imagination as this one does, because it's borrowing from a lot of things, but it very much sets the tone for that type of grimdark future, which as well is another game that will be influenced by that. Well, I think it's quite dated, and it's certainly a little awkward to get through, and there are definitely things that are harder to read. There's certainly some zines I can think of that are important, but tricky to get through. It's successful at laying out some rules that are entirely enjoyable. I mean, what was your feel on this one?
I really agree with taking the Western and putting it in space. We've seen other forms of media do that, like film has done that fantastically, where we've taken like classic Western concepts, tropes, and just made whole sci-fi like trilogies out of them. So that's a whole thing. And I really like that in this game here, as well as the way that it's a toolbox. And I love game systems that are like that. It's not like, here's your 6 scenarios that you play every time. It gives you the suggestion that you're going to be the architect of your own fun. And that's something that I really like in a game system. And this is early in wargaming. So that's kind of how it worked. There wasn't a lot of pre-established things to work off of. But that toolbox feeling is really exciting to me and just speaks of potential, and this game has a lot of it.
Yeah. One historical footnote to make about that is that this game, one of the reasons that I know it directly ties into a game like Necromunda is because it was reprinted in White Dwarf in the 90s as a game called Confrontation, which arguably is different enough that it's its own game, but is a clear connection. And Confrontation is basically Necromunda without any of the specific lore. I mean, it's definitely set in the same setting, but it's not specifying a particular world with a particular political system and named gangs and stuff like that. I think they have things like the Cyber Gang and the Brute Gang, and it's more of a template that you fill in with your own ideas. So I think that's really, that underscores what I think is the main takeaway, is that this is the beginning of something huge.
So that would be Laserburn. I think this has been a really fun read on this book. It's a short one. It's important for the foundation of sci-fi skirmish gaming and sci-fi gaming in general. So if you're someone who's curious about it, go find a copy. I think it's something you might have a lot of fun with, at least from an archaeological perspective. And going into next week, we're going to be back on the role-playing side of things.
But not too far from the group of people that this game ties into, which is we will be talking about advanced fighting fantasy and adjacently fighting fantasy novels and their systems. So join us then, and we hope you have a great time gaming.
Have a great one, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.